My name is Raine Calder. I'm a commander in the Orbital Defense Force, in charge of an interplanetary supply division. My job is to move cargo between Earth, lunar stations, and deep space research posts, on time every time. I've survived meteor storms, navigated pirate-controlled lanes, and coordinated rescue drops in zero visibility. And in all those years, I've never lost a single mission. They say I'm disciplined, unshakable, cold when I need to be. But until that day, no one had ever called me a bride. The wedding was held under the Titan glass dome, an arc of pressure-treated crystal overlooking the black curve of the Pacific horizon. Security was tighter than a high-clearance launch bay, biometric scans at the entrance, AI facial recognition sweeping the guest list every 30 seconds. It wasn't the kind of wedding with hundreds of strangers and a buffet line. No, ours was small, quiet, intimate, mostly fellow officers, a few civilian scientists I'd worked with on orbital projects, and just enough family to fill 2 rows. My groom, Elias Kale, stood beside me in a black ceremonial jacket threaded with silver insignia. The kind of man who could make a room go silent without raising his voice. I remember thinking it was the safest place in the world, until I saw the box. It happened between the toast and the group photos. I was halfway across the dome when I noticed it. A small matte white alloy box sitting on the edge of the gift table. No tag, no ribbon, no sign of who had placed it there. I froze. I'd passed that exact table not 5 minutes earlier. The spot had been empty. Something about the weight of its presence made the air feel heavier. I stepped toward it, instinctively reaching out, and then Elias's hand closed around my wrist. "Don't touch it." Not loud, not sharp, just final. When I looked at him, I expected his eyes to be on the box. They weren't. He was staring across the room, past the guests, past the champagne tower, right at Selis, my cousin, the one who'd been expelled from the Orbital Academy for data fraud, the one who always smiled like she knew the punchline to a joke you didn't want to hear. She was leaning against the refreshment counter, holding a glass of red wine, swirling it in slow, deliberate circles. Her gaze met Elias's, and for a split second, something flickered in her eyes. Half smirk, half challenge, before she looked away. 2 uniformed officers, men I'd assumed were there for ceremonial detail, stood up without a word. One moved toward the box. The other crossed the dome to the main airlock and sealed it. The room didn't panic, but the shift was palpable. Laughter froze mid-sentence. Glasses hovered inches from lips. The box was lifted with gloved hands and carried toward the secure admin wing. Selis was still at the counter until she wasn't. One blink and she was gone. And in that moment, I knew, whatever was inside that box, it wasn't a gift. It didn't take long for the first report to come back from the admin wing. Elias stayed by my side, eyes scanning the dome like he was still on an active operation. The officer who'd taken the box returned, his expression locked in that flat, professional mask that says everything without a single word. He leaned toward Elias, spoke too quietly for anyone else to hear, but I caught one phrase. Cryocore. Her biometrics are on it. My stomach tightened. A cryocore wasn't a trinket. It was high-capacity, frozen-state data storage, used for contracts, military manifests, encrypted shipments. And the fact that it carried my signature, that wasn't an accident. The initial scan showed a contract for an orbital shipment between a shell company I'd never heard of and a station off the Selis belt. The signatory, Commander Raine Calder. Me, date and time of transaction, right now. Exactly as the wedding was taking place. That box wasn't a present. It was a receipt, a confirmation of delivery meant to tie me directly to whatever they'd just moved across the system. Selis didn't need to be in the room anymore. The moment the box landed, her job was done. I felt Elias's hand press lightly against my back, not to comfort, but to steady me. Because the next step wasn't about emotion, it was about evidence. Elias didn't waste time. 3 months ago, he said, low enough for only me to hear, Selis called you in the middle of the night. She said she needed a test login for some simulation. You told her no. I nodded slowly. It was true. But as he spoke, my mind started pulling on a thread, one that had been there for years, just buried under politeness and guilt. It wasn't just that one request. Selis had been collecting pieces of me for as long as I could remember, the kind of favors that seemed too small to refuse. A copy of my DNA sequence so she could order me a personalized gift. My encrypted signature, just to add me to a family greeting card. A temporary access code to test a new game's security feature. Individually, they were nothing. Together, they were a blueprint. A complete, functional replica of my identity in the system. And now, in the middle of my own wedding, she'd used it to drop a loaded weapon in my lap. A transaction I didn't make, tied to cargo I'd never seen. It wasn't sloppiness. It was choreography. Selis had always known my weak spot. She didn't push hard, she just leaned gently until saying no felt cruel. Until one day I wouldn't see the trap until I was already standing in it. That day was today. The NCIS liaison arrived within the hour. By then, the Titan Dome's security feed had already been pulled, every guest's ID re-verified, and the cryo core locked in an evidence case. That's when I heard the second name. Calder, my brother, once a decorated logistics officer in the Orbital Defense Force, until he was stripped of rank for selling route data to private buyers. The kind of man who could look you dead in the eye while picking your pocket. He and Selis had been busy. The investigation showed they'd set up 3 shell corporations over the last 2 years, all using variations of my ID. Same photo, same biometric markers, just enough altered metadata to pass casual inspection. Those companies had been winning contracts to move restricted materials between stations. And because the system thought I was the signatory, every shipment looked clean. The box at my wedding. It wasn't just a receipt. It was the final link in a chain they'd been building for years, delivered on the one day they knew I'd be surrounded, distracted, and too public to raise a scene. Elias leaned in, voice steady. They're not improvising, Raine. This was written months ago, maybe years. And for the first time all night I believed him, because this didn't feel like a single betrayal. It felt like the moment a spider finally stops spinning and pulls on the thread. The interrogation room was all angles and cold light. No windows, just a table, 2 chairs, and the soft hum of the recording system overhead. Selis was already seated when I walked in. Her posture was perfect, hands folded neatly on the table like she was waiting for afternoon tea. Her hair was immaculate, makeup untouched, like she'd been planning for this too. When the door closed, she looked up and smiled. Raine, you look. I raised a hand. Don't. The smile faded, but only a little. She blinked fast, buying herself a pause before speaking. I thought you'd understand. Understand what? My voice was flat. That I wasn't trying to hurt you, she said softly. Your name, it opens things, doors, accounts, trust. We just borrowed it. I didn't sit down. You didn't borrow me, Selis. You installed me like malware into something I never agreed to. Her jaw tightened. I was scared. Calder said we'd never pull it off unless it looked real, unless someone real was attached to it. Attached, I stepped closer. You didn't attach me, you weaponized me. Her eyes flickered. Can you fix it? She asked. There it was, the real reason she was looking at me like family again. If I cover for you now, I said, leaning over the table, I become you, and that's never going to happen. The silence that followed was heavier than any slam of a door. I turned and walked out without another word. Because this time, I wasn't staying to be the strong one who cleaned up her mess. This time, I was walking away before she could rewrite me into her story. I met them at a diner off the transit ring. one of those old gravity-locked places with peeling booths and syrup baked into the air. I'd chosen it because it was neutral ground, or so I thought. My mother was already there, sipping black coffee. My father arrived 3 minutes later, posture rigid, eyes scanning me like I was a report that might disappoint him. No hugs, no small talk, just silence. I slid a sealed data chip across the table. You'll want to see this. They didn't reach for it. My father gave it a single glance, then laced his fingers. We're not sure what you want us to say, my mother murmured. I want to know when you found out, I said. That pause, just one beat too long, told me everything. Then she said it. Selis and Calder told us you knew that it was a shared business, something military adjacent. My father added, you've always been private. We thought maybe this was classified. No, I said, my voice sharper now. You didn't think, you didn't ask, because asking might mean finding out something you'd have to confront. They didn't argue. They didn't deny it. And that was worse than if they had. I stood up. Strength isn't fixing the wreckage I didn't cause. It's knowing when to walk away from it. I left them there in that sticky booth diner with the evidence they refused to touch, because the cleanup wasn't mine anymore. The next morning, I walked into the Union's security bureau with a case file so heavy it could have been a weapon. Inside, every forged contract, every false authorization, every transfer signed with my name but not my hand. The intake officer glanced at my rank insignia, then at the evidence list, and called for a federal liaison on the spot. Within an hour, I was seated across from Commander Raine, a JAG investigator with the kind of presence that makes you sit straighter without meaning to. You've done most of our work for us, she said, scrolling through the data. I'm not here for shortcuts, I told her. I'm here for clarity and charges that stick. Vera's eyes narrowed at a forged orbital clearance form. This one alone puts it past identity theft. It's conspiracy, cross-jurisdiction, civilian and military. Then I want every name on it, I said. Civilian, military, family. She studied me for a moment. You understand what that means? Court-martial potential, open investigation, frozen clearances while this runs its course. It won't be quiet. I'm not looking for quiet, I said. I'm looking for the truth to stand on record. She nodded once, sealed the evidence packet, and slid it into the secure transfer tube. Then we start today. As I left the building, I felt the weight shift. Not because the fight was over, but because, for the first time, it was in the right hands. A month later, the investigation was still grinding forward, names being cross-checked. Accounts frozen, routes shut down. I'd stopped counting the updates. The case no longer lived in my hands, and that was exactly how I wanted it. One night, I reached for a jar of spice in my kitchen, the one Selis always grabbed when she pretended to help cook. Behind it was a folded slip of cream stationery. 5 words in her looping hand. Still family with love. No signature. No apology, just that same soft handwriting she'd always used to hide everything sharp. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I carried it to the oven, slid it onto the broiler tray, and lit the flame. It didn't curl theatrically or scream into smoke. It simply collapsed into ash, quiet and final. When Elias came through the door, he caught the faint scent of burn in the air. You okay? He asked. Not okay, I said, wiping my hands on a cloth. Just clear. He nodded once, because in our world, clarity was better than okay. Clarity didn't erase betrayal. It didn't rewind the wedding or scrub the records, but it let me stop flinching at my own name. They'd sent me a box meant to bury me. I didn't touch it, and that changed everything.